Hello. How much do I need to grow to be self-sufficient in food for a whole year? I'm Zorab and this is Byther Farm. One of the things that I'm asked most often is how much food someone needs to grow to feed their family for a whole year. And I thought today I'd have a go at answering that question. So here we are, end of March, and I'm starting to harvest some salad leaves from the polytunnel. I've got some rocket and some baby spinach and also some baby kale. I've still got lettuces. But I want to try and explain how I decide how much of everything I'm going to grow to help you plan for self-sufficiency. One of the key things is for you to be honest with yourself about how much fruit and veg you actually eat, because there's no point in growing loads of food if you actually don't eat very much of that particular food, unless you know beforehand that you're going to be able to swap it with somebody who's growing something else, and you can do it in exchange for something that you do like. So for example, a couple of years ago, my next door neighbour and I agreed at the beginning of the growing season that I would grow all the runner beans for both houses, and he would grow all the courgettes for both houses, which meant I could use more of my growing space for other things that I know I like. So there is an exchange not only about actual goods but about a space allowance as well. The simplest way to work out what you actually eat is to think about a typical week of food in the winter and the spring and the summer. So in the winter we eat a lot of soups and stews, so we probably use at least one onion a day for winter and spring, or autumn and winter and spring, about 6 months of the year. So it's one a day, so we need about 180 onions to see us through the winter there. And then we also use onions in the rest of the year as well, but probably only half that number. So I think I'm looking at something like 270 onions that I need to grow to see us through the year with onions. And although we've got the luxury of plenty of space here, that still takes up quite a lot of bed space in the garden. And things like potatoes, well, we've changed how we eat. So I grow potatoes to eat when we first harvest them. I store a few of them, but not very many. And when they've run out, I then move on to other root veg that will store in the ground over winter. So parsnips, celeriac, carrots, swede and root parsley, which we only tried for the first time last year. I really like it. So we've adapted what we think of as some of our staples to fit in with what can easily be stored in the ground, and it means that we have to grow less volume of potatoes, and I also have less storage issues because our potatoes need to come out of the ground and then be stored somewhere. So to be able to store my carb-rich root vegetables in the ground is an absolute bonus for me. And leading on from that, you'll also need to think about your storage methods, how you're going to store all the produce that you're growing. Here in the UK, there are lots of vegetables that will sit in the ground quite happily over winter. So lots of brassicas, lots of root vegetables. There are some foods that I just wouldn't attempt to store, so things like lettuces, I like to pick those fresh. So if I want lettuce all year round, I need to think about ways to grow that in small numbers, but a constant flow of it throughout the year. And that's possible by carefully choosing your varieties, which means that by late summer and early autumn I'm sowing seeds for lettuces that will see me through the winter and in the early spring, particularly when we get that hungry gap, and it will allow me to keep going with those fresh leafy salad foods. So once you've decided which vegetables you eat the most and most often and how much you eat of them in a year, it's now worth having a look at the alternatives to those vegetables, so that you build in a bit of security and resilience, because if one crop fails and you're heavily reliant on it, you're going to be stuck for food for the rest of the year. But by growing a wider variety and some alternatives, hopefully if one fails, the other one will see you through. So let's go back to those onions. I was going to grow 270 onions, which takes up quite a lot of space. But I also know there are other ways to get that oniony taste in my food without having just the bulb of the onion. As onions start to mature, their leaves will bend over and the tops will flop over. And at that point, I will harvest that greenery. I'll leave some stem for the onion, but I take most of the greenery away, take it into the kitchen and I chop it up into very small pieces, and then I freeze that and store that, because those onion greens are much like spring onions or scallions. You can just use those in your cooking, and they're great in things like omelettes and flans and stir fries. You've got a mild onion flavour. It's not necessarily that mild, but you've got a milder onion flavour, and what it actually does for me is it almost doubles in volume the amount of onion flavour that I can get from each plant. So I have the bulb that I store by stringing up the onions, and then I have all the green leaves that are chopped and put in the freezer, and just there. I don't even need to defrost them. I just grab a handful of frozen leaves and throw them in the cooking, and they defrost very quickly as you're cooking. And the other thing that I do is I replace some of the onions with leeks. So over here I have a tray of baby leeks on the go. I'm really pleased with how well these are growing. These are Musselburgh. They are much smaller than the other leeks that I've got going. So I grow a lot of leeks. Leeks can be planted fairly closely together, and are really good at sitting in between other crops. And then as you harvest the other crops, you're left with the leeks standing there for the winter. And you can eat the white part of the stem, the green part of the stem, but you could also do as I do with the onions. You could take the green leaves from the top and chop those, freeze those, and then you've got that leaky, oniony flavour to add to food later in the year. And that means that you're using more of the plant, so the growing space that you're using it becomes more efficient. Because I know we really like red cabbage. I grow lots of red cabbage. So here they are. I've planted up 30, which is a huge amount of red cabbage. Now, last year I grew 12 and harvested them all pretty much at the same time, and shredded them and got them into the freezer as spiced red cabbage with apple and things like ginger and cinnamon and clove, and they were lovely. And I then froze it into 2 people portions, so that I could just take enough for one meal for the 2 of us out of the freezer. And that's not necessarily the most efficient way to store them, but because I'm not very good at doing things in the winter, I know I need to prepare food in autumn for us to eat in the winter. Cabbages can also be stored in netting in a cool place like a shed or a damp-free garage. I'm aware that it looks like I grow an awful lot of food. I do, but it's not only for us. I'm actually growing for 20 other families this year. They're having a veg box a week, so I'm growing a lot more food than just for our family. When I was growing for just our family, I think the size of the vegetable garden would be adequate, and there are very, very wide pathways there. So in terms of actual growing space, I think you could do that in a reasonable sized back garden or on an allotment where you've got very narrow pathways and you grow intensively. To try and get the most from the space that I have, I grow crops that as much as possible have a dual purpose. So these beetroot, these are beetroot chogia, which I sowed in the autumn. But the leaves, the young leaves, can be picked and used in salads and in stir fries. And as long as you don't strip the whole plant and you leave some leaves to help the plant grow, you can have these as a crop, and then you actually get the roots as a crop once that's grown as well. And the same with peas, and these are mange tout or snow peas or sugar snaps. These were grown during the autumn and winter for the pea shoots. I harvested the shoots, pinched out the growing tips, which made the plants even bushier. It's kept them really small, and now that the weather has warmed up, they're growing like mad from multiple stems and producing lots of snow peas, or the mange too. So I'm getting 2 crops from the same space, and that's what I try and do as much as possible. And the same applies for things like broad beans. You can eat the broad bean tips once they've grown and produced about 4 or 5 sets of flowers. You can pinch out the tips, which does 2 things. It discourages black fly from attacking them, but it also gives you another green leafy meal. And by using as many crops as possible in 2 ways, the amount you need to grow is suddenly drastically reduced. In my next newsletter, I'll include a piece about all the vegetables that I use as dual purpose plants, to give you some hints and tips about how to do that. And if you aren't already signed up to the Byther Farm newsletter, I'll leave a link in the video information so you can do that. And so, wherever you are in the world and whatever you've got planned for today, I hope it's a good one. And I also hope you'll join me again next time.